Hi everyone, and welcome to this virtual ICML 2020 tutorial on representation learning without labels. My name is Ali Islami, and I will be presenting alongside Irina Higgins and Danila Rosende. I'd also like to acknowledge Mihaela, Shakir, Alex, Olivier, Brian, Stephen, and David for their help in preparing these slides. The agenda for this tutorial is that we'll be doing it in 4 parts, each part roughly 30 minutes long each, and we'll have 15-minute Q&A sessions after each part. I'll do the introduction and the second part, building blocks, which will be providing a very high-level motivation and overview of modern techniques. In the third part, we'll go a bit deeper and look at the landscape of methods, comparing them along various important axes. And in the fourth part, we'll zoom back out and provide an outlook for the field. It's important, I think, to be clear about what the tutorial is. The tutorial, as I said, will be an overview of building blocks. It will be a comparison of methods, but we're going to focus on the image modality for lack of time. And what the tutorial isn't is a comprehensive list of all relevant techniques. We just think it wouldn't be possible to do that in 2 hours. And also, we're not going to focus much on representation learning for other modalities other than images. So we're not going to talk about text or audio or video or graphs and so on. I also want to provide several disclaimers. The first is that this is a huge topic with a vast multidisciplinary history. And so inevitably, we will miss important related work. It just wouldn't be possible to do the whole field justice in the amount of time we have available. Each citation that we provide is only meant as a representative example of a particular idea. And we really recommend you use those examples as seeds for websites like connectedpapers.com that show you all of the relevant literature surrounding a paper. Also, there are many views and perspectives on the literature in this field, and we're only going to be providing one of those views. And therefore, we will inevitably oversample some works and undersample other works. Also, it's important to say that the presentation is not necessarily chronological, meaning that if a paper is shown first in the slides, it doesn't mean it was discovered in that order. Finally, if you have any pointers or suggestions, please email us or contact us on Twitter. We will make the slides available after the presentation, and we'll do our best to keep them in the best state possible. So if you have any feedback, let us know. And you'll see in the top right-hand side of the corner of the slides, these yellow boxes. That's where we'll be putting the citations. So please pay attention to those boxes and follow up where necessary. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so let's just jump right in. I'd like to start by talking about a philosopher you might have heard of before, Plato. He lived about 2,400 years ago. He's often depicted in pictures with his finger pointing at the sky. And the reason for this is that, as opposed to Aristotle, he believed in a philosophy of forms or ideas, which was that there are certain truths that are outside the realm of reality. And he used the allegory of the cave to describe this philosophy. And this allegory, I think, is actually insightful for the kinds of problems we're trying to solve in artificial intelligence. So let's go through it. What Plato believed was that our condition as human beings was that of a bound observer placed in the bottom of a cave. And this observer has a wall behind them where there are some true objects placed on that wall. Now, the observer can't directly look at the objects because of the way in which they are bound, but what they can see instead are shadows projected on the wall in front of them by those objects due to the firelight behind those objects. So in this allegory, the observer only sees these impoverished shadows, these impoverished projections of those true objects. And what they're trying to do is to figure out what these objects are, what their nature is, how they behave, and so on. And in Plato's allegory, what he's trying to make clear is the fact that as an observer of the reality around us, we never have full observability. We're always viewing an impoverished projection of that reality. And anyone who's done computer vision is very familiar with this fact. So more precisely, in this allegory, we have the true object that creates an image through the image formation process. And that image is observed by the bound observer, who then forms a representation for the object that they think they're looking at via the image. And of course, the objective is to form representations that are meaningful and close to the truth. And again, it's important to note that the observer never has direct access to the true object. It's only through these projections. So for instance, if the object we're looking at is a vase, we want the image to invoke in the observer's mind the idea of a vase, or the representation of a vase. Now, of course, it turns out to be a little bit more complicated than this, because this object isn't just its class, but it has other attributes. It has a shape, and that shape, for instance, could be represented either by its name or by, a mesh, perhaps, or a voxel grid or a point set. Of course, it has a color, it has height, weight, it has properties like whether it's scratched or if it's broken or not. It might be moving or not. And there's many other attributes that this observer might be trying to reason about when viewing this object through the shadow. So as I said, which attributes will the observer focus on? What formats will the observer represent each attribute in? For instance, height, is it going to be in centimeters or in inches? Color, is it going to be a string or is it going to be RGB values? Shape, is it going to be a mesh? Is it going to be a voxel grid or something else? Also, how will the observer deal with partial observability? That is, for instance, in this simple example, color will not show up in the shadow. So the observer will have to have some mechanism for representing uncertainty about color. Also, how quickly are these representations formed? Is it a fast feed-forwards process that produces the representation in milliseconds? Or is it something that will require significant deliberation on the observer's part? And perhaps most importantly, how will the observer measure success? Remember, the observer doesn't have direct access to any kind of truth. It's just the relationship with the shadows. And so how will they know that they've represented things successfully? Now, people in the computer vision field have obviously thought about these problems for a long time. Back in 1978, Mar and Nishihara write that vision is a process that produces from images of the external world a description that is useful to the viewer and not cluttered by irrelevant information. So that description is the representation. The usefulness is the fact that we want to use those representations for downstream tasks. And this point about it not being cluttered by irrelevant information is emphasizing the point that we have to decide what we retain about the image in the representation and what we discard. And more precisely, they say that a representation is a formal system for making explicit certain entities or types of information, together with a specification of how the system does this. So it's the system and the process that produces the contents of that system. So 2 points I want to highlight even further. One is that representational form is orthogonal to information content. So you can think of a representation being a space, and then a single point of content is a point in that space. And these two things are what constitutes the representation, and we will use the word representation interchangeably here. Also, that representations are, to some extent, ultimately about abstraction. That is, to compute things that will make downstream computations and tasks more efficient. And that's why we're after representations. Now, many of you will be familiar with the supervised solution to the representation learning problem. The supervised solution first starts off by deciding which attributes that we want to care about. And this decision is made by humans. So for instance, we say that in this cave allegory, we're going to care about the class of the object for which we're seeing the image. Then we decide the format for each attribute. So for instance, we're going to say that I'm going to represent class with a string. So this first image, its class is vase. The second image, its class is ball. The third image, its class is dog, and so on. Then we're going to create a large labeled data set of image and labeled pairs. And then we're going to train a big neural network to predict the labels given images. And of course, this is a formula that you will have heard of before. It works extremely well on a diverse set of problems. Many of the tools that we now use in the real world make some form of supervised training part of their solution. However, I think it also raises several important questions. First of all, who provides the ground truth for the labels? How do we choose the person, ultimately it's a human being, that gives those labels? What if we don't know the ground truth ourselves? What if we can't find any person who would give us good labels for the task that we're interested in? Are we just stuck there, or is there something that we can still do? How do we choose which attributes we label? How do we choose which attributes we ignore for labeling? Remember, we want to learn representations that are going to be useful for downstream tasks. What if we don't know what downstream tasks we care about? How do we make these decisions in absence of knowing what we will do with those labels, with those representations later? Even once we do label, what biases do they propagate? Someone might call this a ball, someone else might call this a sphere, someone else might call it a round object. Each one of those will have an effect, effectively, on the representations that are learned. Are we doing harm by assigning labels in a particular way? And then stepping back, looking at the field from perhaps outside, do we really think that children learn purely from labels? Or are they making use of other learning schemes to come up with the representations that they have? In fact, do animals learn from labels at all? In the absence of a formal language, how do they learn that some things are dangerous, some things are tasty, some things are not dangerous, and so on? So all of this can be summarized with this last question, question 8. Can useful representations develop without labels? We can study that question as a scientific question that we might be curious about. Can useful representations develop without labels? If the answer is yes to this question, we actually have two big wins. The first, obviously, is that we can learn more efficiently when we do gain access to the labels. So this is the data efficiency argument. But the second, which is perhaps less explored, is that if we can learn representations without labels, we can still learn useful things when label collection is impossible. So consider, for instance, scenarios where objects are imperceivably small or microscopic, or situations where objects are very far away, so we can't observe them with our naked eye, or situations where the phenomena that we're studying are too complex to be processed by a human brain, like, say, the economy, for instance. In those settings, if we have effective representation learning schemes that don't need labels, then we can potentially come up with useful representations without having been limited by a human mind. But nonetheless, both 1 and 2 are really exciting prospects. I want to spend some time digging into some terminology. You'll hear people using terms like supervised and unsupervised, or labeled and unlabeled. But actually, often it's difficult to formally distinguish between these two types. For instance, supervised versus unsupervised, or labeled versus unlabeled. Consider, for instance, image captioning, where you have the task of predicting for a given image what a caption for that image might be. In the data sets that we collect, the specification of the caption, is that a label for that image, or is it merely an example of a potential caption that could make sense? In machine translation, when you have an English-French sentence pair, the specification of the pairing itself is a sort of label, right? But it's not exactly a class label that we've been talking about so far. In reinforcement learning, the specification of the reward can be seen as a label too. Perhaps it's not the same as a labeled data set, but there's a human mind behind the specification of the reward function. In generative models, as we'll see in a bit, we often have structure in the model, and that can be seen as an artifact of the human mind too. And in fact, language modeling, which is often seen very much at the unsupervised end of the spectrum, a human is choosing what data set that language model is being trained on. If you train on data set A, you'll get very different results as compared to data set B. You'll get different representations. And so, in a sense, there's a human involved in making that decision. So it's difficult to distinguish between these two ends. And instead, what I will assert is our objective is to reduce reliance on labels that can only be assigned by human brains, and instead learn more from raw measurements of the world. And so we're not trying to completely remove labels, we're just going to try to be less reliant on the kinds of information that can only be assigned by human brains, that are only the products of human brains. Still, the word unsupervised and words like unlabeled are actually rather convenient, and so you will hear us using them in our language. But what we're trying to do, as I said, is to reduce reliance on human-produced information. Now, I want to make this even further clear with an example. So imagine you want to learn representations for musical instruments that you will then use later on to either classify those instruments or predict how they will sound or describe them in a caption and so on. The supervised approach, which makes heavy use of human labels, says, I'm going to get a human being to assign a name to each one of these instruments. Say one of them is a violin, another is a viola, another is a cello, and we've got santurs and sitars and all sorts of instruments. And then I'm going to train a supervised network to predict those labels from these images, and in the process, I'll learn a representation. An alternative approach is to record videos of these instruments being played and associate those videos with the sounds that they produce, and come up with a learning scheme that learns representations to make this association. Now, this learning scheme, if it succeeds in learning these representations, will have learned these representations without a human mind assigning any labels. All we need is a video camera and a microphone, and voila, we have our representation. And to me, this is much more satisfying than the original approach, which required human names to be assigned. You know, someone might call something a violin in a different culture, it might be called completely differently. Now, supervised and unsupervised learning obviously have been around for a while, even since back in 1949 when machine learning was coined. Up until about 2006, people largely worked on methods like feature engineering and kernel methods, often with supervision. In 2006, folks started using restricted Boltzmann machines to train without labels an initialization for neural networks that would then be used for classification with labels. And of course, in 2012, we went all the way back to fully supervised training without the need for pre-training. But now there's a resurgence of interest in representation learning without labels again. So important people in our field like Hinton, LeCun, and Bengio have come out to say that they believe this is something that we should be focusing on. But I also think that it's important to emphasize that this is not an uncontroversial view. There are people who think of it as a red herring. So for instance, Rodney Brooks of Roomba fame and obviously of robotics fame had this really fascinating paper back in 1991 called Intelligence Without Representation, where he says that there is no clean division between perception and reasoning in the real world. The brittleness of current AI systems attests to this fact. So this view is that instead of thinking of representation learning as a precursor for intelligence and task competence, we should actually see it as a side effect. So first you learn to do tasks, and what you find is that you get a representation out as a side effect. I just thought it would be important to mention this viewpoint because it also exists, and it has very many proponents. Nonetheless, I think now really is a fascinating time to be studying representation learning without labels, especially because over the past year or two, we've actually seen tremendous progress in this field. I'm going to show two plots from two recent papers that show this in the realm of NLP on the left and in the realm of image processing on the right. So in both of these plots, we have on the x-axis the percentage of labeled data or the number of labeled data that we have on the downstream task that we care about. And on the y-axis, we have performance. So SQuAD is a question answering data set in NLP, and ImageNet classification is image classification in computer vision. And the two curves in each plot, one of them demonstrates performance without pre-training, without unlabeled pre-training, and the other demonstrates with unlabeled pre-training. And the same over here. So this is without unlabeled pre-training, and the blue curve is with unlabeled pre-training. And in both of these fields, we're now beginning to see representation learning without labels significantly boosting performance. So we see that, for instance, in ImageNet classification, we're making use of about 80% fewer labels in the very low data regime and about 50% fewer labels in the high data regime. And both of these kinds of results are effectively the holy grail of representation learning without labels. They have been for many years, and it's really exciting to see so much progress so quickly. So I'm going to end this first part here. In the next part, we'll talk about the building blocks that these modern methods use, and welcome back to the second part of our tutorial on representation learning without labels. In this part, we're going to be talking about building blocks. So let's just jump right in. You might remember from the first part that we talked about the realm of images and the realm of representations. So images are these impoverished projections of reality, and representations are the observer's mind's eye view of that reality. And in this context, there's actually two processes that are important to think about. One is the process that goes from images to representations. Some people call that understanding. And the other is the process that goes from representations back to images. Some people call that imagination, or the image formation process. Now, remember, we don't have access to the actual real object in this context. And so all we really have to go by are these two processes. Now, there's a whole zoo of methods that people have come up with, so many that we wouldn't be able to cover all in this tutorial. But what we're going to try and do is go over a dozen or so models, looking at what they have in common and trying to extract common components or building blocks that we can use to create new models into the future. So the first component that is perhaps most obvious is the representation or encoder or inference network. So this is a neural network that takes an input X and processes it to produce a representation R. In these diagrams, I'm going to use this shape for X, even though in reality it's probably going to be two-dimensional or n-dimensional. And the representation R, I'm going to draw as something smaller to indicate that we would like it to be more abstract, but it's generally going to be a vector or potentially a very large vector. Now, in designing representation networks, we get to choose several things. We get to choose the size of R, whether it's smaller or larger than X. We get to choose its structure, whether it's flat or if it's interpretable, and whether it's continuously valued or if it's discrete, whether the shape is fixed or it changes for different inputs, whether it's disentangled or not. We also get to choose the architecture of the network itself, whether it's an MLP or not, whether if it's a convnet or a transformer or an RNN. Now, more generally, the representation network doesn't have to be a network at all. It could be an inference algorithm, and this is what was often done before the rise of deep learning. And inference algorithms vary in terms of whether they're differentiable or not. So neural networks are obviously differentiable, but you might be using search or sampling to come up with a representation R, and those processes might not be differentiable. The algorithm could be interpretable, or it could be a black box. It could be deterministic, or it could be stochastic, meaning in the stochastic case, for a given X, you might get different Rs. Now, the second component that is perhaps obvious to think about are generation networks or generators or decoders. So this mirrors that of the representation network, except now it takes the representation R as input, processes it, and produces an output X prime. And like the representation network, the architecture of the generation network could be an MLP, it could be a deconvolutional net, it could be a transformer, it could be an RNN again. And generally speaking, X prime has similar shape to X, but that doesn't always have to be the case. And you can also step back from neural networks and consider cases where you have an algorithm that's actually producing this output. It doesn't have to be a neural network. Sometimes these algorithms are called simulators or renderers. And again, they could be differentiable, like with a neural network, or they might not be. They might be interpretable. For instance, it could be a graphics program or a renderer, or they might not be. It could be deterministic or stochastic. And we'll see examples of this over the next few slides. Now, if you put these two components together, you end up with an architecture that is very well studied, and that's the architecture of autoencoders. So the idea here is that you take X, you pass it through the representation network to get R, you pass that through the generation network to get X prime. And you train autoencoders to make X prime as similar as possible to X. And typically, this is done with a likelihood-based objective. So you want to maximize the likelihood of the true input X given the predicted X prime. And it goes without saying that these autoencoders can be drawn in different ways, horizontally or vertically, or even broken into two pieces. So here we've got a vertical depiction of an autoencoder. And this figure on the right is from Hinton's famous 2006 science paper, where, for instance, they trained autoencoders on faces. So you have the input face being processed by an MLP down to a 30-unit representation, and then being processed back up with the decoder to a reconstruction of that face. Now, autoencoders can be used for a variety of things. Density estimation, that is assigning a probability to each input. Dimensionality reduction, that is reducing this input, which might be high dimensional, to a small number of numbers that you would use to save on memory. Image generation, that is after having trained this, you sample representations and you produce new images. Or denoising, where if you have a noisy input, you go through the autoencoder to get a denoised output. But what we care about for the purpose of this tutorial is representation learning. That is, if I give an input to this encoder and I get a representation, how useful is that? How much does it capture the contents of the image? Now, the intuition with an autoencoder or autoencoder-like methods is that if the autoencoder is successful at reconstructing the inputs accurately, then this representation must somehow encode enough information about the input to do that reconstruction. And the hypothesis is that this representation, therefore, is a good representation. It's going to be a useful representation because it is both concise and accurate. One way people visualize the learned representation space is by what they call latent space traversal. So here, imagine I've trained an autoencoder on MNIST digits, and the representation space I've chosen to be two-dimensional. So R has two components to it. What I can then do is I can change each component individually. I can basically walk around this two-dimensional space and pass the representation R that results in that space through the generation network each time to produce an image. So the 7 is what I would get if I was in the top left-hand side of this space. As I move along that space in different directions, I get different generations from my network. And this is basically the intuition that people use when they sample from these generation networks. They want to show that by moving around the space, they're getting meaningful samples out. Now, what some people have worked on is what they call disentangled autoencoders, where they try to take this vector R and actually break it down into components. So in this example, we've broken it down into 4 components. And they encourage learning to learn components that are somehow independent from each other or orthogonal to each other or disentangled from each other. By modifying the loss in just the right ways, you might end up with a representation vector that has these properties. So for instance, what you can do is you can take your representation and you can vary one component at a time and observe what effect it has on your samples. So here I modify R1 and I see that as I do that, it's taking the same shapes and it's moving them up and down. If I modify another component, it's taking those shapes and it's moving them side to side. And a third component is modifying their colors. So the hope here is that instead of having all of these factors entangled with each other in this representation space, you have those factors be axis aligned effectively, which allows you to do this kind of analysis. Now, another obvious modification you can make to the standard autoencoding architecture is to make the representation and generation networks sequential. Whereas before we just had an MLP or a convnet that was producing R, and then an MLP or a convnet that was producing X prime given R, we can now replace them with RNNs. So the idea here is that you process X to get the first R, that produces an intermediate reconstruction or canvas. And then you repeat this process, creating refined Rs and refined canvases until you have your final reconstruction X prime. Now, obviously, one of the benefits that you get from this is that you have a more powerful encoder and a more powerful decoder in terms of simply the number of layers in your neural network. But there's another reason why you might do this. So in this paper, Gregor and co-authors, they took an architecture of this kind. And what they did during training was train as I described, but at test time, what they could do is they could limit the number of times the representation network could look at the input to produce the reconstruction. And by limiting it in this way, what you can do is you can control the number of bits effectively that the representation network can send to the generator. So these Rs are sent by the representation network, and in absence of the remaining Rs, the generation network basically has to sample to produce reconstructions X prime. And this is what it looks like in practice. So here I'm showing samples or reconstructions from a sequential autoencoder where the number of bits that are being transmitted has been restricted to 76 or so. And the original raw images are more like 25,000 bits. And you can see that if you can only submit 76 bits, what you end up getting are very kind of perhaps abstract or basic shapes and colors. Now, as I increase the number of bits, I get to see more detail and more form and more texture, until at around 220 bits or so, I'm beginning to see object shapes. Like you might see that this looks like a dog and this looks like a human. And at even more bits, you're getting to see very sharp details emerging and effectively the content of the image. So the idea here was that by going to a sequential autoencoder, we're getting some control over which parts of the representation are more conceptual and which parts are more fine-grained and low-level details. Another way you can modify sequential autoencoders is by putting in interpretability. So we take the sequential autoencoder and then we say that we want each R at each stage to have specific meaning. So we want one part of R to represent the continued presence of another object that needs to be explained, the other part to describe what that object looks like, and the third part to contain information of where it is in the image. So this architecture produces one of these triplets for each object that it encounters, until in the final stage it says, presence is false, I don't detect any new object, and therefore I want to terminate, and the generator produces the final X. So this video shows what that results in. I have an interface here where I'm drawing new digits onto a canvas. And this is the reconstruction produced by the autoencoder on the right. And each time it detects an object, it draws a bounding box around it. And you can see in the bottom, the shape of the autoencoding network actually changes in response to the input image. And this is an example of a case where you have a representation that is changing shape in response to the complexity of the image. Now, another way you can modify the original autoencoding architecture is, for instance, by making the representation 3D in a sense. So in this work, what we did was we took images of a scene. So these two images are of the same scene, and we took the corresponding camera viewpoint that those images were taken from. We passed them through a particular network architecture to produce a vector R, which we call the scene representation. Then this R is passed to a generation network that takes a new camera viewpoint and a randomly sampled Z and produces a reconstruction of what it think it would see had the camera been in that viewpoint. And our hypothesis here is that if we can train the network to do this successfully, then this vector R has necessarily learned the contents of importance in that scene. So it will represent what objects are present, how many objects are present, what colors they have, and where they're placed in the scene. So this is an example of the kind of results that you get. In the top, I'm showing you the observations, these impoverished projections of reality. And in the bottom are the predictions made by a learned generation network. So as I move the camera around, I see that it kind of places the object sensibly. The jittering represents this uncertainty over locations and contents. And you can move the camera either in circles or completely freely, moving in between the objects. So again, the hypothesis is that the only way in which the generator can succeed at this task is if the neural scene representation R has encoded the objects of interest, their positions, their colors, and so on. And note that at no point have we actually provided any human supervision in the form of labels. We've never told it what a sphere is, or what a cylinder is, or what the color blue looks like, and so on. Yet another way that you can represent scenes is shown beautifully in this recent work, NERF, where instead of representing the observation with a vector, the representation itself is a neural network. So the representation has weights and biases and an architecture. And the process of producing this representation is actually optimization. So given an input, you run an optimization algorithm to produce a representation that is a neural network. And to get a reconstruction, you do forward propagation through this network to get your reconstruction. Now, this neural network is a much more complex object than just the vector, and therefore it can retain information that would otherwise be lost in a finite length vector. The kinds of samples that you can produce are just remarkable. So these are viewpoints that are synthesized through this neural network with forward propagation. And you can see that the network is capturing complex things like refractions and reflections and lighting and fine object details and so on. Yet another way you can set up the autoencoder is by saying that, I don't want R to be a vector anymore. I want it to be a voxel grid. And so you have your input, you pass it through your representation, you literally get a voxel as your representation, which you can then use to produce the reconstruction. And the benefit of having a voxel representation is that you can then render that object from different viewpoints. Another way you can do it is you might say that I want my representation to be a mesh, not just a voxel grid. Now, to get from a mesh to your reconstruction, that might not be an easy thing to do with a neural network, so we might choose to use software like OpenGL, for instance. And OpenGL, you can approximate the gradients through it with finite differencing. And this is the kind of result that you get. Input image is 2D, representation is a mesh, and then output you can render with OpenGL to get new results. Or you might say that I want to represent my object with an implicit function. And this recent work shows this very beautifully. Input image, you get your representation, and you can use that to render that image from different viewpoints. Now, it's again important to reconsider the fact that inputs are partial observations. So these representation and generation algorithms will have to encode, in some sense, their priors over object shape and content to do these kinds of predictions. Now, everything that I've talked about so far has been likelihood-based, which means that we've been training encoders and decoders so that we maximize the likelihood of the reconstruction or the prediction given the outputs of the generator. But one difficulty that they have is that we have to effectively specify in code what we consider to be a good reconstruction or a good prediction. That notion of similarity turns out to be actually quite difficult to specify. But it's something that you can learn. So with generative adversarial networks, people introduce the concept of a discriminator. So a discriminator is a neural network that takes either inputs of type 0 or type 1, and it's trained to predict whether it's observing a 0 or a 1. So for instance, it might get either real images or images generated by a neural network, and it has to detect if that image is real or if it's generated. And when you train a discriminator in conjunction with a generator like we had before, you end up with a generative adversarial network architecture, or GANs as they're called. So what the GAN does is trying to train a generator that generates good images, and the measure of the quality of those generated images is specified by the discriminator. The discriminator, as I said before, is trying its best to tell between real and fake images, and the generator is trying to fool the discriminator. If you train this well enough, many of you will have already seen these kinds of images. You end up with generations that are remarkably real-looking. And this level of fidelity has been shown to be very difficult to achieve with likelihood-based methods, although there's lots of great progress recently. But you will notice that in this architecture, there is no mechanism actually to go from an image X to a representation R. All we have are techniques that go from R to images X. But it turns out that you can get around this with architectures like ByGAN, for instance, and there's other equivalents, where we now combine representation networks, generation networks, and discriminators. And the way you get this to work is by modifying the discriminator so that it's not just looking at the image to detect whether it's real or fake, but it's looking at an image representation pair. So it's trying to identify whether this pair, this R0X0, is real or if it's fake. And if you train this well enough, you can do reconstruction. So you can take this image, for instance, you can represent it to get R, and then you can pass it through the decoder to get your reconstruction. And what the authors here are trying to show is that the learned ByGAN is representing the conceptual features of the image whilst ignoring the perhaps less relevant details. So here, for instance, it kind of knows that it's looking at a farm scene, but it hasn't spent its capacity modeling the details of the grass or the sky. And the hypothesis is that that representation will therefore be useful for, say, scene classification, more so than the raw pixels. Now you can take this even further, combining many of the different components that we've come up with so far. You might say that you want to have a recurrent representation network, a non-differentiable generation algorithm, and you want to make use of discriminators. And the reason you might want to do this is because, for instance, you have a particular program that you want to constrain your generation with. So in this case, we chose a paintbrush simulator like Photoshop, for instance. And the objective was to learn representations that could use this simulator to produce reconstructions of sufficiently high quality. And in advance, we knew several things. One was that the program, the representation network, would have to interact with the program multiple times in order to produce a reconstruction. And that's where the sequential nature of the network comes from. And second is that the simulator simply, there's no way that it will produce pixel perfect images. And so a likelihood-based way of training this might not work. And that's why we use the discriminator. And if you train this well enough, what you end up with are representations that are now physically plausible, at least to the level that is modeled by your paintbrush simulator. So we have an input image. It's now represented as a sequence of strokes that we can send to our simulator to produce the reconstruction, or we can send the exact same sequence of strokes to a simulated robot or even a real robot to produce those reconstructions. Now note that an autoencoder would never be able to do this by default because the representation is a vector, whereas here our representation is more akin to a program. And if you train the same system on, say, human faces, you end up with reconstructions or samples that are actually remarkably similar to how a child or an amateur painter or a cubist painter would draw. So this system has learned to represent faces not as pixel perfect objects, but as a constellation of, two eyes, a nose, lips, and the outline of the face. Now again, remember that at no point has it ever seen a human painting. At no point has it ever seen how humans paint. It's learned this representation, this fairly abstract representation, because of the architecture of its representation network and its generation algorithm. Now, I want to switch gears and talk about methods that aren't generative at all. So everything we've talked about so far has involved, in some sense, reconstruction of the inputs. But it turns out that you can get away without this. And here's an example of how you could do that. So imagine we start off with a data set of color images, and we deliberately turn them into black and white, monochrome images. And we pass these black and white images through a representation network. And the way we train this representation network is by asking it to produce the colors that should correspond to that image. So for instance, this is a tiger. Tigers have orange fur. So we wanted to predict the orange fur for the tiger and the green for the background. And the hypothesis here is that the only way in which this network can succeed is by first effectively understanding that it's looking at a tiger, even though it won't know the name for a tiger, but the concept of a tiger. And then after that saying, okay, because of that, I need to predict orange. And the genius here is that at no point do we label things as explicitly tigers or grass. We just give it images and their associated colors, and through that process, it will implicitly learn classification. Or another way of doing this is with rotation prediction. Here's an image, it's upside down, and I want the representation network to predict that it's upside down and it should be rotated by 180 degrees. Again, the only way it can do this is if it recognizes that this is a tiger, and tigers rarely occur in this configuration, therefore it needs to be rotated by 180 degrees. So this is another example of a task that implicitly coerces the network to learn about concepts that we care about. Now, there are a whole variety of techniques in this space. Some people call it self-supervised learning. I really recommend looking into Andrew Zisserman's slides on this topic that was presented 2 years ago. And there's a whole bunch of papers at CVPR this year as well. But there's one technique in particular that I think warrants further investigation for this tutorial, and that is contrastive learning. The architecture that I'm going to be discussing is the one described in SimClear, which will be presented at ICML this year. It's a simple architecture and it gets really good performance. So what happens here is we start off with two seed images, a picture of a dog and a picture of a tiger. The picture of the dog we augment twice. And what I mean by augment is we transform it by, say, cropping or flipping or changing the colors. And we also augment the picture of the tiger. So now we have three images, x1, x2, and x3. And we pass each of these images through the same representation network to get R1, R2, and R3. Now, we know that R1 and R2 correspond to the same object because they came from the same image. And we know that R3, because it's coming from a different image, is probably a different object in a different class. So R1 and R2 are considered to be a positive pair of representations. R1 and R3 are considered to be a negative pair, and R2 and R3 are considered to be a negative pair. And all we need to do is we need to say R1 and R2 should be close to each other, so we attract them to each other. And R1 and R3 should repel each other. They should be far away. Similarly with R2 and R3. Okay, so imagine we've done this and we train this. How do we know whether we've succeeded in learning good representations R1, R2, and R3? One way people do this, and it's become a bit of a standard in the field, is with linear separation. So the idea is that after you've done the training that I just described, you freeze the representation network, and then you train a linear network on top of your representation with labels to predict, say, ImageNet classes. So representation network is trained without labels, is frozen. Linear network is trained with labels on ImageNet. And if you do this, you find that a method like SimClear that I just presented ends up getting actually remarkably high performance. So this is 76% top 1 accuracy on ImageNet classification with only a linear network trained with labels on top of the learned representation. And for comparison, I'm also highlighting the BIGAN approach and the rotation prediction approach. To put this in context, the 2012 AlexNet paper, which some would argue sparked the deep learning revolution, only gets, if I remember correctly, in the order of 65% on this task. So we're getting much better than a relatively deep AlexNet network with a single linear network on top of this unsupervised representation. Another way that you can evaluate data efficiency, another way that you can evaluate the representation network is by looking at data efficiency. So here, after unsupervised pre-training, we don't fix the representation network anymore, but we stick another network on top, which is task-specific, and we train it on a task that we care about, but we restrict the number of labels that we give during this supervised training process. So we have the representation network being trained without labels first. Then we fine-tune the representation network along with the task-specific network on a small number of labeled examples. And these are some results that you get from by using something like SimClear. So they're getting 75% top 5 accuracy with only 1% of the ImageNet labels. And this is in opposition to what you would get if you hadn't done pre-training, which is only 48%. So that's almost a 25% percentage point improvement because of unsupervised pre-training. And a third way in which you can evaluate your representation network is by transfer learning. So you do unsupervised pre-training, then you stick on a task-specific network and you train it on something that you haven't seen before. So for instance, you might do Pascal detection. And again, results from SimClear show that this is very, very competitive and in some cases actually outperforms supervised pre-training, for instance, in object detection. Now, finally, I want to talk about the surprising return of likelihood-based models, and in particular, a paper that was released just a few days before this tutorial was recorded, and that's ImageGPT by OpenAI. And the idea here is shockingly simple. So you take your image, you represent it obviously as pixels, but you flatten it down into a vector. So you effectively get rid of all the spatial structure. Then you train big transformer networks on 2 different tasks. One is next pixel prediction on the left, or you do masked pixel prediction, like what people do in natural language processing with BERT. And afterwards, you have a big, deep transformer network, and you can evaluate your ability to do linear classification from each layer of that network. So you have your transformer, you stick a linear network on top of the representation, you freeze the transformer, and you make predictions, say, for ImageNet. And before I show you the results of those linear probes, I want to show you some samples from the model. So this model, if it's trained well enough and for long enough, can produce amazing image completions. Given the top half of this image, it produces these beautiful sheep. And given the top half of these birds, it produces the possible completions. So it's very good as a model of pixels, but it's also actually very good in terms of its classification on ImageNet with that linear probe. It's not quite state-of-the-art, but it's competitive, meaning perhaps a return of interest in likelihood-based approaches to representation learning without labels. Okay, I'm going to end it here with a summary. So I hope you will have seen that representation learning is really underspecified. There are many representations that one could come up with for a given image. And there's 2 broad categories of approaches for dealing with this underspecification. The first is to build in structure, effectively tightening the bottleneck so that you end up with the right representations. And that's what we saw with the structured autoencoders, for instance. The second is to train for proxy tasks that can only be solved if you have the right representations. And that's what we saw with, for instance, contrastive learning or rotation prediction. In my view, current approaches also always seem to involve a trade-off between the generality of the representation, i.e., what range of downstream tasks the representation is good for, and their interpretability. So to what extent we can actually understand the representation by unpacking it and looking at the different variables. So there seems to be a tension between those two things. In my view, general representation learning without labels is still largely unsolved. I don't think anyone has legitimate claim to know how we should be doing this. And that's partly what makes it such an exciting field to be working in. Recent advances, however, are very promising, and I look forward to seeing what people do with this stuff next. Now, in the next part, we will talk about the landscape in a little bit more detail, comparing these different approaches across a bunch of different axes that are important. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Danilo, and I'll be talking about generative models. So, as we have seen before, we talk about the different approaches to representation learning. Some involve generative models, some don't. And here we'll focus on a unifying perspective of various generative models that have been used for representation learning over the several last years. We can think in terms of a taxonomy of generative models represented by this tree highlighted at the top of the slide. And this tree roughly categorizes models as directed or undirected, as implicit or explicit, or as being latent variable models or exact likelihood-based models. And we will expand every branch of this tree in the follow-up slides. But first, when we talk about generative models in machine learning, we are really talking about three things combined. The first thing is the generative process itself, which is what we traditionally would call the generative model in statistics. But we also group together the model with the learning principle, which is the thing we're going to optimize to make the model solve the task that we wanted to solve. And in general, we cannot directly approximate the we cannot directly use the learning principle that we choose. We have to resort to some kind of approximation. So we cannot really disentangle the model from the learning principle from the approximation that's used, because these three things have to be chosen together in practice. Now let's see in more details this taxonomy of generative models. At the very top, we have these two major classes, which are undirected and directed models. Undirected models are what some people call energy-based models as well. So they are just models that prescribe a unnormalized likelihood function on observed data, but there is no prescribed mechanism for sampling from this density. So you have to resort to external algorithms and approximations to do that. Directed models, they prescribe both a likelihood and a mechanism of sampling in a causal way. They prescribe a order in which you have to sample the variables. And directed models can be further broken down into two major classes: explicit and implicit models. Implicit models are models that provide a sampling mechanism, but do not have an explicit or cheaply computable likelihood function. Explicit models, on the other hand, they provide both a sampling mechanism and the likelihood function. And you can further break this class into two kinds of models. First, models with exact likelihood, which direct attribute likelihood to the data. And another class of models, they attribute likelihood jointly to the data and some unobserved variables. And in general, these models also require some approximation to train. Obviously, implicit models can only be trained with approximate algorithms. So, and at the bottom, I provide a few examples of models that live in each of these branches. We can represent all these models into graphs, which express relationships between random variables. So in these plots, random variables are represented by circles, and the dependency structure is given by these arrows and lines. So we have autoregressive models at the top and factor graphs at the top right. And at the bottom, we have a simple representation of latent variable models. On the bottom left, you have explicit latent variable model, and on the right, it's the notation for implicit latent variable model, where the circle, you can note the missing circle, the variable x at the bottom, which indicates that there's no likelihood of function there. Now, we will focus first on directed models, but we will focus mostly on directed models, but a lot of the things we'll discuss in this next slides are generically applicable to any generative model. And we will then go back to undirected models in the end. First of all, what does it mean to learn a model or train or fit a model? So generative models, they define either explicitly or implicitly a probability density. Probability density is a function that tell us how concentrated the data is in different regions of space. And what does it mean to fit in light of this? It means that we want to approach the density function defined by the model by the density of the data, according to some measure of mismatch between these two densities. This measure of mismatch between densities is what we call a probability divergence, which is simply a functional that takes two divergences and outputs a non-negative number. And it outputs 0 if both divergences are exactly the same. So once you have decided which divergence we want to use, we should start setting an optimizer that will try to minimize this divergence. On practice, though, there are infinitely many divergences we can use. And the challenge is how to choose between them, because each one of them will emphasize a different aspect of how the model should match the target density. And this is particularly important under the assumption that the models are not perfect, which is the most reasonable assumption we can make. As an example, here, imagine that you have this bimodal target density shown by the black curve, and the model can only produce a single mode, so it's a Gaussian-like model. By minimizing each various different divergences, you can still get different answers. So which answer you want, it's really up to you, depending what kind of task you want this model to be useful for. So this is a design choice that's also part of the model, and it cannot be made in advance in a principled way. It's really a situation-dependent choice. Now, most of the vast majority of publications in generative models focus on one particular family of divergence, which we call the F divergences. So F divergences are defined on the left side of this formula, and there is a very nice result which relates the F divergences to another type of divergence, which we call the integral probability matrix on the right. So what this formula means is that we can bound the expression on the left by the expression on the right by choosing a suitable test function phi, and calculate difference in expectations under the target density and under the model. The reason why this formula is so interesting is because F divergences are practically impossible to use simply because they require the knowledge of the density of the target data. But on the right, all we need are samples from the target. We can see that the only term involving the target density is the expectation of this test function phi under the data. So that makes it a very convenient in practice, because now all we need is to sample from the data. Moreover, the same thing happens with the model. On the left, we have to know the density of the model Q. And on the right, we don't. All we need is to sample from the model. This is the key idea that allowed GAN's model to flourish and become so popular, is that this simple relation allows us to train these models just using samples and not using explicit likelihood functions. As I said, this theorem relates F divergences to integral probability metrics via this upper bound. And there are various integral probability metrics that are known and used in various GAN publications. When we put everything together, we can now write our final objective to solve, which is we still want to minimize the divergence between the target density defined by the data and the model. So we want to minimize this density with respect to the model Q. But the expression of the F divergence in terms of integral probability metrics measures provide us an upper bound, provide us a lower bound on F divergences. So we have to maximize this lower bound first. So the resulting problem is the saddle point, where, so that results in a saddle point which now we have to solve with our optimizers. And the fact that this is a saddle point makes it very hard for this to work in practice, but a huge amount of progress, both theoretical and heuristic trial and error based algorithms have improved a lot our ability to solve this kind of min-max problem to make GANs work. For a particular choice of F in F divergences, we can have both a lower bound on F divergence and an upper bound on F divergence. And this upper bound is what we call the negative elbow, up to a constant. The difference between the IPM integral probability measure bound to the F divergence and the elbow is that the elbow is a convex function of the model in function space. So there's no saddle point, there's no min-max optimization. It's just a min-min problem to solve. This makes optimization much easier, but under the constraint that the elbow requires explicit knowledge of the likelihood of the model. So as I said, examples of on both sides of these inequalities for F divergences are GANs and VAs. Various GANs that have been published over the years, they are just they have different formulations and written in terms of different losses, but they can most of them can be mapped back to the F divergences, as I said, and this paper provides a dictionary of the F functions that explain various different versions of GANs. Okay, now that we gave a general overview of VAs and GANs and geometric models and probability divergences, let's expand a bit on the VA models. So, as I said, the VAs are explicit models with latent variables, and there's a huge literature in this family of models, which will not expand in details, but we'll focus on a simple aspect of VAs now. Okay. So before we dig into any of the training details of a VAE, I just wanted to do a little bit of a translation here. So in the first part of the talk, Ali talked about autoencoders, and he used graphs like the one on the left here. So these graphs are computational graphs. So this graphs is how we implement the model in the computer. But in terms of as a generative model and that defines a probability density, we use the representation on the right that contains both that explicitly have the separation between latent variables, observed variables, and an inference mechanism. In practice, when you put all these things together to actually train the model, the computational graph that will result from the variational approximation that we will discuss in a bit looks like the graph on the left. So now expanding a bit the math of this graph, we want to compute its likelihood, but because there are latent variables, we have to solve to marginalize them out, and for any interesting kind of model, we cannot do this integral exactly. So in practice, what we do is to introduce a test density, which is easy to sample from, which is also called proposal or encoder or variational posterior model, and apply a inequality based on the concavity of the log function to derive a lower bound on the likelihood. Again, this is just a derivation of this bound I showed a few slides ago on F divergences. This variational bound can be understood in terms of two terms that have a very clean interpretation. The first term is what we call the reconstruction term, or in information theory, it is distortion term, and another KL divergence term between the approximate posterior or encoder and the prior of the model, which is a form of regularization or a rate term in information theory. So now we have a tractable objective function for this model, which is called the elbow, evidence lower bound. On practice, when you put everything together, that's how the problem looks like. As I said, once we put the approximate inference together with the generative model, the resulting computational graph looks like the graph on the left. A very simple instantiation of this model was given the two papers above, and they are defined as having a simple spherical Gaussian at the top and a neural network that takes that Gaussian and transforms it into an image. Okay, so talking about GANs. Before we start, I would like to write the likelihood of a GAN in the same way as we did for the VA. So when you do that, we see that we start seeing better why they're not so different. The formula, as we show here on the right, is almost the same as in the VA slide, with the difference that you have this delta function instead of a smooth P of x given Z density. So as a generative model, that's really the only difference between the two families of models. But GANs can also be seen from a different perspective. So at least the algorithm that is used to train GANs can be seen from the perspective of estimating probability ratios between the model density and the target density without knowing the probability densities explicitly. So how do you estimate the probability ratio without explicitly computing the densities? Well, it's known that a classifier should do exactly that. So a classifier that's training to distinguish samples between model target model density and data density should learn exactly the probability ratio between the two densities, if optimization works. Based on that, we can build a new loss, which is based on the heuristic that a generative model that is good should be able to fool the discriminator, in the sense that the discriminator should not be able to tell the difference between samples from the model and the data. And this leads to this loss in the middle there. And now that results into a min-max kind of objective function there. So as I said, so this is a different perspective in how to derive this loss. But at the beginning of the slide, they provide a much more general perspective that where this kind of which generalizes completely this view of interpreting a GAN in terms of lower bounds to F divergences. Okay, we have covered VAs and GANs, and let's talk about energy-based models or undirected models. So these models are defined by some energy function. There is also a enormous literature on that. The main idea is to try to solve the task implicitly via optimization. So the model defines the energy, and the answer to the task that we want to solve is some minimum of this energy. So this is one view of the problem, which is illustrated in this slide. Here we have a pair of image X and the label Y, and we build a joint energy between these two quantities. And the decision of the model is the label that minimizes this energy. So that's one way of thinking about energy-based models, is a kind of implicit way of defining the answer of a machine learning system. Again, these slides are just illustrating what should happen to the energy landscape. As we optimize this, the idea is that the energy should grow everywhere except where the data is, except where the manifold of the data is, where the energy should go down. So it forms a valley with the minimum at the correct answer. This is just illustrating the same thing, but with more emphasis on the landscape of energy. But now the challenges of learning this energy function. So if you try to write the log likelihood, explicit likelihood of a energy-based model, it will look like the form at the top of this slide. So it's just some x of minus the energy. The issue is that we don't know how to normalize this density. So we have to compute the normalizer in some way. This normalizer is the integral of this exponential. And it can be very hard to approximate this integral in practice. So if you try to compute the gradient of the log likelihood of such model, we get this formula at the bottom. So the first term is very easy. It's just the gradient of the energy computed at the data. So this is very cheap, relatively speaking. But the second term is the thing that is hard to compute. It's the expectation of the gradient of the energy under the model itself. So on practice, the only way you can to approximate this is by producing samples from the model. But as an implicit model, as a energy-based model, we don't know how to sample from this model cheaply. So there are many things we can do. Before going to alternative algorithm, I'll go through various ways we can use to sample from this model. So one of the simplest things we can do is called the Langevin sampler. So this is very popular in machine learning papers because of its simplicity. Langevin sampler is merely a gradient, a descent algorithm with noise. But the nice thing is that we can prove that such a simple sampler will converge to a sample from the target density if you wait long enough. On practice, because we have to discretize time, this guarantee is lost and it becomes approximate. But there is a way to correct that with a acceptance rejection-based algorithm which sees the Langevin samples as just proposals, which are then accepted or rejected with some probability given by this formula. And the paper indicated above provides the optimal value of this acceptance rate that we should tune the algorithm to achieve. An alternative algorithm to sample from an energy-based model is a Hamiltonian Monte Carlo sampler, which is a different with a different way of interpreting the target density by augmenting the space with a momentum variable and adding an extra energy term for this momentum variable and following the Hamiltonian dynamics. So the algorithm is also pretty straightforward to implement. We sample initial momenta from a Gaussian and then evolve the momenta according to the Hamilton equations of motion indicated above. And in continuous time, it is also guaranteed that the marginal distribution over the position x will match the target density. Again, the same thing that happens with the Langevin sampler. On the computer, we have to discretize time, and that introduces an error of the sampler. And the way to fix that is with an acceptance probability, which is calculated in the formula below. Okay, so now we have explained that if you want to maximize the likelihood of energy-based model, we have to, if you want to do this explicitly, we need to compute a term which involves a sampling from the model, and we expanded two algorithms to produce such samples. But this whole strategy is quite expensive. We need to produce fresh samples for each gradient update of the model. This is very expensive procedure. However, we can think about a different divergence that doesn't explicitly involves maximizing the likelihood of the model, but using a different way of matching the density defined by the model to the data. And this can be done via what's called moment matching. And the moment matching is merely trying to get the gradients of the density with respect to the data to be equal for both model and the data. And you can easily convince yourself that if this is achieved by the model, then the probability density of the model is proportional to the density of the data. The nice thing about this objective function is that it doesn't require explicit samples from the model, and it can be calculated only using samples from the data. So that's a really good property of this loss function. The tricky bit of using this is that it involves the trace of the hashing of the model, of the likelihood of the model, which in many problems is prohibitively expensive. But there are also tricks to reduce the cost of that via a stratified sampling. So this algorithm has shown very promising results recently as well. Now I will let Irina take over the different levels of modeling. Thank you very much.
In the second part of this section, we will look over our model zoo through a different perspective. First, we will consider manifolds and how thinking about their topology may help us troubleshoot the existing representation learning methods and develop new ones. Then we will look at the differences between modeling data using statistical, causal, or physical methods. Let's start by thinking about manifolds. Many of you probably have heard of the manifold hypothesis that underlies a lot of what we do in machine learning. The manifold hypothesis suggests that real-world, high-dimensional data lie on low-dimensional manifolds embedded in the high-dimensional space. Let's unpack that. Let's imagine that our data consists of images of a 3D dragon shape taken with a fixed camera, but under different lighting conditions, where the source of light moves on a sphere around the dragon. In the pixel space, this data will form an n-by-n manifold. However, since we know how the data was generated, we know that we can also represent it using a significantly lower dimensional manifold of a 2-sphere embedded in a 3-dimensional space. Taking this even further, some of us might want to go ahead and compress the representation into a 2-dimensional Euclidean space by projecting the sphere on a 2D plane. Indeed, there are many working examples of useful 2D projections of a 2-sphere, geographical maps for once. However, any scholar of projectile geometry will point out that such projections will create distortions in size, angles, distances, or directions. Different projections will preserve different properties, but no projection can preserve everything. Hence, the main point I will try to make in this part of the talk is that finding the right low-dimensional manifold for our high-dimensional data is something that is worth thinking about in more detail, because when it is not done carefully, we can end up in a situation where the topology of the true data manifold is disrupted in a way that can be problematic. In order to start thinking more about manifolds when designing our models, let's understand them better by introducing some basic notation from differential geometry. A manifold is a topological space that locally resembles a Euclidean space. Let's look at the circle, one of the simplest manifolds. If we zoom in on an infinitesimal piece of the circle, it will look like a straight line. Furthermore, we can find a continuous and invertible mapping or a homeomorphism from a segment of the circle, for example the yellow arc, to an open interval on a line, in this case from -1 to 1. Such functions are called charts. The set of all charts that cover the whole manifold is called an atlas. These concepts should be pretty familiar intuitively if you have ever heard a geographic atlas of the world in your hands. We should also typically be made up of many pages or charts that are flat 2D projections of the different regions of the world. When we move between different pages of the geographical atlas, we know how they correspond to each other because of the small overlaps that exist between them. The same thing allows us to move between the different charts of a manifold. For example, to move from the top chart to the right one, we can use the composition of the inverse of chi top and chi right. The resulting function is called a transition map. Note that for each manifold, we can come up with many different choices for charts, atlases, and transition functions. Here is an example of a different atlas for the circle that consists of 2 charts rather than 4. Manifold need not be connected or closed, as demonstrated in these 4 examples of 1D manifolds. Here, each manifold is indicated by its own color. Not connected manifolds consists of a union of multiple disjoint non-empty sets, like the red, blue, or green examples. Manifolds that are not closed extend to infinity, like the open-ended parabola or hyperbola. These manifolds are 1D because locally each of these manifolds resemble a 1D line. The H-shaped form on the right is not a manifold, since at the point where the 2 circles meet, it is impossible to find an invertible smooth mapping to a line. Here are some examples of 2D manifold. Each one locally resembles a 2D plane. It is important to note here that the Euclidean space is also a manifold, but it is a manifold where the atlas contains a single chart, and this chart is just the identity function. We can measure distances, angles, and areas easily using inner products and other well-known tools from Euclidean geometry. The Euclidean space is the one where our intuitions hold and calculations are easy. So we strive to operate in such flat, simple manifolds. Unfortunately, real-world data often lives on more complicated, curved manifolds, where these intuitions break down. On curved manifolds, distances cannot be measured with straight lines. The sum of all angles in the triangle is not equal to 180 degrees, and the ratio of the circle's circumference to its diameter is not equal to pi. The implications of this is that many properties that we may desire to unlock by learning representations may not work on curved manifolds. For example, the parallelogram model of analogy making, like inferring that the relationship from king to queen is the same as the relationship from man to woman, popularized by word-to-vec embeddings, breaks when it is applied over curved manifolds, like the manifold of 3D rotations. So how do we calculate distances or geodesics when talking about curved spaces on curved manifolds? To give you a flavor of the complexity of the task, we first need to introduce the notion of tangent spaces. Let's imagine we have an n-dimensional manifold M with a chart phi. Let's also imagine that there is a curve that traces a path on the manifold parametrized by a function gamma of t, and which passes through a point x when t is equal to t0. Any point on this curve can be represented in Rn by projecting it through our chart phi. Now imagine that an ant is crawling on the manifold along the path gamma. Its velocity at point x will be the vector v, which is the derivative of p with respect to t at t equals 0. Note that since p is in Rn, the velocity vector will also be in Rn. V is called a tangent vector at point x. Now, gamma t is just one of the possible paths on the manifold that passes through the point x. There can be many possible such paths. The collection of all possible tangent vectors obtained from all possible paths that go through the point x on the manifold makes up the tangent space at point x. The reason why we care about tangent spaces is because we need them to define a Riemannian metric used to measure distances on smooth, curved manifolds. A Riemannian metric is a family of functions g that take in two tangent vectors at the same point x on the manifold and outputs a real number that measures the distance between the tangent vectors. This distance will change smoothly as the point x is smoothly translated on the manifold. The Riemannian metric is the generalization of the inner product that we are familiar with on Euclidean manifolds, but with the additional term that corrects for the distortions introduced by the non-zero curvature of the manifold. One way to calculate this correction term is by taking the product of Jacobians of the function q that maps points from the tangent space to the high-dimensional Euclidean embedding space. Given that the manifold curvature may be different at every point, the tangent space will also be different, and so will the metric. Hence, while on flat Euclidean manifolds the metric is identity, if we want to calculate distances on a curved manifold, we need to know the full tensor field of the Riemannian metric at every possible point on the manifold. This leads to two options when it comes to building models. We either stay on the original data manifold and try to learn its metric, or instead we try to learn a projection to a Euclidean manifold where the metric is simple. As you may imagine, staying in the original manifold is hard. Some of the earliest unsupervised learning methods for dimensionality reduction and clustering, like PCA, were operating on the original data manifold. These methods could broadly be described as performing two steps. First, the data similarity matrix would be calculated. Then, a form of spectral decomposition or a softer embedding optimization objective would be applied. As we have just seen, the first step is the crucial one. Most of the methods use naive Euclidean-based metrics, which work well if the data manifold is curvature-free, but in the majority of cases it is not. For example, when applied to the curved 2D Swiss roll manifold, these methods fail. In order to improve the situation, two directions were proposed. Kernel methods attempted to implicitly estimate the potentially complex similarity metric between data points without having to learn the metric explicitly, while spectral approaches introduced an extra step of building a nearest neighbor graph to estimate the topology of the manifold, and then performed the final spectral decomposition steps over the graph Laplacian. While these steps helped, they were still not perfect. Given how hard working in the original data manifold space is, there isn't a great number of approaches that attempt to do so. However, one recent paper is worth pointing out. In this work, Fao et al. Tried to discover disentangled manifold factorizations using ideas from differential geometry. As you may remember from Ali's section, disentangled representation learning attempts to find an interpretable factorized representation of the data, while virtually all approaches to disentangled representation learning attempt to learn a mapping from the original data manifold to a Euclidean-like low-dimensional space. This work aims to find meaningful factorizations in the original manifold space. The intuition is that meaningful transformations would commute with each other even on a complex curved data manifold, because this manifold can be decomposed into a product of simpler manifolds. For example, a torus decomposes into a product of two one-spheres. Fao et al. Then use ideas from differential geometry to discover such manifold factorizations. The main idea is that if you take a basis set of tangent vectors and walk them around a loop on a curved manifold, this is called parallel transport, these vectors would get distorted to different degrees. Those basis vectors that would get distorted through parallel transport would belong to the tangent space of the manifold we walked on, while those vectors that remain unaffected by the walk would belong to the tangent space of other manifolds that make up the product. Fao and colleagues were able to demonstrate that this method could discover the correct number of submanifolds that make up the product, as demonstrated by the red vertical lines in the figure, and recover their tangent space as well, even for products of up to 5 manifolds. While this work is only a first step towards developing a useful disentangling method that preserves the topology of the original data manifold, it opens up an exciting novel research direction. As we have seen, working in the original data manifold is hard. Hence, the majority of representation learning approaches, and in fact, every algorithm described by Ali in the second section of this tutorial, belongs to the second group of approaches that try to learn a projection to a Euclidean space, whether explicitly or implicitly. When it comes to contrastive learning, which, as we saw from Danilo's talk, is an instantiation of energy models, and is sometimes also referred to as metric learning, the loss that shapes the representations typically relies on a calculation of similarity between pairs of embeddings. While this similarity function can be defined to be arbitrarily complex, in practice, most methods use simple distance metrics, like the L2, cosine similarity, or dot product. All of these implicitly assume that they are operating on Euclidean vector spaces. In adversarial learning, the generator learns a map from the low-dimensional representation manifold to the high-dimensional pixel space manifold. The prior over the representation space is often chosen in a way that assumes a Euclidean manifold. Assuming Euclidean topology of the representation space can, however, lead to problems when the topology of the true data manifold cannot be smoothly mapped to it. For example, in the case of the spherical manifold of 3D rotations. This results in unnatural jumps and distortions when we try to visualize a walk on the representation manifold, as was pointed out in the case of GANs by Tucker-Cohen. Autoencoder architectures don't necessarily put strong constraints on the nature of the learned latent manifold. However, this still often results in undesirable behaviors. For example, in an experiment described by Waters et al., the underlying data manifold was actually Euclidean, sampled from the product of uniform distributions of horizontal and vertical positions on a single sprite. In order to visualize the learned manifold, the authors took images corresponding to a grid of points on the true data manifold and projected them into the latent space using the trained encoder. We see that the VAE encoder learned the mapping from a Euclidean input manifold to a non-Euclidean representation manifold. On the other hand, the implicit regularization within the factor VAE model with the same architecture as the VAE, but optimized for disentangling, was able to recover the original manifold topology well. To conclude, thinking about the topology of the original data manifold and the explicit or implicit restrictions on the topology of the learned representation manifold may help troubleshoot problems with the existing representation learning approaches and help develop better methods. Now, let's turn our attention to the different levels of modeling. So far, all the models Ali and Danilo have talked about were examples of statistical learning. Statistical learning is what machine learning excels at. The assumption is that the data is observational and presented IID, and the models extract the statistical dependencies between the different variables present in the data. This is the weakest form of relationship that can be extracted, since it has no directionality. We don't know what causes what. We just know that certain correlations exist. We also can't do counterfactuals or any other interventions on the learned representation, which might be useful for many downstream tasks. Furthermore, as is argued by Bernard Sholkov in his great paper linked above, the IID assumption is quite restrictive and may be the cause for many known vulnerabilities of the modern machine learning methods. For example, problems with generalization or susceptibility to adversarial attacks may be caused by inputs that break the IID assumptions. One way to deal with these problems is by moving to the higher, so speaking, modeling level afforded by the causal methods, which discover directional causal dependencies between the data variables and are capable of capturing more information alongside the statistical dependencies. Sometimes we may also want to model our data at the highest physical modeling level, implemented through a system of coupled differential equations. Such a model provides the full description of the system, since it allows us to predict any future state, extract statistical dependencies among the variables, and calculate the effect of causal interventions. Unsurprisingly, as we move up the different levels of modeling, the learning problem becomes harder. Indeed, up until recently, the physical level of modeling required human physicists to handcraft the differential equations. Recently, however, a number of models have been proposed that are starting to be able to learn such physical models from data. For example, the recent Hamiltonian generative network can be seen as a variational autoencoder with a recurrent core inside. However, instead of a discrete RNN, the recurrent dynamics are modeled using a learned system of ordinary differential equations called the Hamiltonian equations. The Hamiltonian formalism is one of the generalizations of Newton's laws of motion. In this framework, the dynamics of the system are described in something called the phase space, which is a set of position and their corresponding momentum coordinates. When visualized in phase space, Hamiltonian dynamics trace out trajectories that never cross their own path. A Hamiltonian is a function from the phase space to a scalar that represents the energy of the system. The continual dynamics are modeled by taking the partial derivatives of the Hamiltonian with respect to position or momentum. So, to calculate the next position, we use the derivative with respect to the momentum, and to calculate the next momentum, we use the negative derivative with respect to the position. The equations on the slide are presented with the Euler integrator for simplicity. In practice, more advanced integrators are used. Since HGN can learn the dynamics at the physical level by discovering the Hamiltonian equations governing the time evolution of the data, it can do more than the usual statistical generative models. Not only can it produce plausible samples and reconstruct the given dynamics, it can also roll out the system infinitely forward and backward in time, do jumpy rollouts by varying the integration time step at test time, and the dynamics are guaranteed to respect a relevant set of symmetries. As a side note, the HGN work also connects back to the manifold hypothesis by augmenting it. Not only are natural images thought to lie on a low-dimensional manifold, but natural image sequences are also thought to correspond to motion governed by abstract Hamiltonian dynamics, thus further constraining the nature of the manifold. Going back to the different levels of modeling, we can further understand the implications of their differences using the example of disentangled representation learning. As Ali has mentioned in his talk, the statistical perspective to disentangling sees it as the problem of modeling the joint distribution of pixel observations X and an assumed ground truth factorized interpretable latent distribution Z. However, assuming that the only observable is the distribution P of X, where the latents Z are marginalized out, we end up with a pessimistic result. As was articulated in the work by Locatello and colleagues, learning disentangled representations in a purely unsupervised setting with no further inductive biases and assumptions on the data or models should be theoretically impossible. As stated in their Theorem 1, we can take any disentangled factorized representation Z and find a mapping F such that the new representation is still factorized and the observable marginal distribution of the data is still the same, but the new representation F of Z is completely entangled with respect to the original factorization Z. Hence, the ground truth disentangled representation is not identifiable. The reason why the many existing statistical models for unsupervised disentangled representation learning, like BTVE and other VAE-based models, work in practice is because of the implicit biases present in the data and its interactions with the optimization dynamics, as was explained more technically by Rolinek et al. And more intuitively by Burgess et al. In the papers linked. So, if statistical unsupervised disentangled representation learning is brittle, can a causal view on disentangling help? First, let's formally introduce structural causal models, or SCMs. In an SCM, each observable random variable can be expressed as a deterministic function of its parents in a directly acyclic graph and independent source of noise. Given an SCM, we can go back to a statistical model by recovering the conditional probabilities of children conditioned on their parents. The nice thing about SCMs is that they automatically factorize into independent causal mechanisms. What this means is that in an SCM, intervening on one of the causal mechanisms does not affect other mechanisms, and knowing about other mechanisms does not inform about the given mechanisms. Note that because of the structure of SCMs, independence of mechanisms is a notion of independence between functions and not of random variables. These considerations naturally lead to a causal definition of disentangling. We assume a causal model for observations X with the generative factors G, where the generative factors can be influenced by confounders C. If the resulting model can be described as an SCM of the form shown, where G's are a deterministic function of the parent confounders and independent sources of noise, and X's are a deterministic function of parent generative factors and independent sources of noise, then we have a disentangled causal model. The causal view of disentangling matches the statistical view through properties C, D, and E that I will not go into. But it also has nice properties over the statistical model. First, the causal mechanism P of x given G is invariant to the changes in distribution of G. This means that the learned model should be more robust to covariate shifts, for example, to novel examples of color and shape combinations never experienced during training, as long as the underlying causal mechanisms are learned correctly. Second, it allows for groups of latent causes G to be dependent, unlike the statistical model that limits the modeling power of the models by assuming that each generative factor has to be modeled by a single independent latent variable. While the causal definition of disentangling is still relatively new, and hence building robust and scalable models based on this perspective is ongoing work, the causal definition has produced a nice disentanglement metric that is more reflective of the intuitions about disentanglement than metrics based on the statistical view. Here, two models are shown that were scored similarly highly by the statistical disentanglement metrics. But as you can see, they are scored differently by the causal metric. In the top row, as we change the value of position y generative factor in the rightmost subplot, we see that the values of the other learned latents that represent changes in position x, orientation, scale, or shape remain relatively invariant. So this model scores highly using the causal disentanglement metric and matches our intuitions for what disentangled representations should look like. On the other hand, changes to scale in the second row result in significant changes to the other latents of the model, indicating that this representation isn't well disentangled intuitively, and it is also scored low by the causal metric. Moving on to the physical definition of disentangling. A vector representation is called disentangled with respect to a particular decomposition of a symmetry group into subgroups if it decomposes into independent subspaces, where each subspace is affected by the action of a single subgroup, and the actions of all other subgroups leave the subspace unaffected. Let's unpack that. Symmetries are those transformations that keep some aspect of an object unchanged. Group theory is used to talk about symmetries. Groups can be discrete, like the cyclic group, or they can be continuous, like the rotation group. For example, a cyclic group of order 3 can be used to describe the rotational symmetries of the three-legged symbol shown on the left. And the rotation group of order 3, SO3, can be used to describe rotational symmetries of a two-sphere. A group is just a set G, together with an operator that maps two elements from that set to another element in the set. These elements can be symmetry transformations, and the operator is a way to compose these transformations. The elements in the set have to be associative, there needs to be an identity element, and for each element there needs to be an inverse. That makes a group. As I said, each element in the group can be a transformation, so they need to transform something. Hence, we introduce the notion of group action. For example, if we have a group of integer addition modulo 3, it may act on a set W of equivalence classes of integers modulo 3. So, if we start in the 0th element of W and apply transformation G1, we will move to element 1. If we then apply G2, we will get back to the 0th element. Hence, G2 is the inverse of G1, and their composition, as shown in the table, results in an identity transformation. The group we described in the last slide is called the cyclic group of order 3, since it cycles over 3 elements. We can also define its subgroup. Here is a cyclic group of order 2. A subgroup needs to contain a subset of elements of the original group and still be a group. If we have two groups, we can also define their direct product. The direct product will be another group with elements that are a Cartesian product of the elements of the subgroups, and the operator will be defined component-wise. We can always recover the original two groups from their direct product by finding tuples with a single non-identity element. Now we're equipped to understand the physical definition of disentangling. Let's suppose we have a simple grid world that can be completely described by direct product of three cyclic groups that act by changing the horizontal and vertical position of the sprite, as well as its color. The abstract state of such a world can be described by set W. When we apply a transformation from one of the subgroups, it changes the corresponding part of the tuple in W. Now, we assume that there is a generative process B that maps the world states into high-dimensional observations that are fed into our model. And the model implements an inference function H that learns a representation Z. We also call the composition of B and H function F. So if we can learn an equivariant map F so that we can apply a group transformation and then go through F, or first go through F and then apply the group transformation without affecting the final state of the representation, then it will induce a disentangled representation Z. Since this definition disentangling talks about learning a representation that decomposes into independent subspaces that reflect different symmetry transformations, and physical models of dynamics like the Hamiltonian generative networks learn dynamics that respect symmetries, there is hope that the physical level of modeling may lead to better disentangled representation learning methods, although this is still an open area of research. To conclude this section, Danilo and I touched on a few different theoretical lenses that can be used to systematize the diverse model zoo of unsupervised representation learning methods, first outlined by Ali. We suggested considering how the different methods approach data density modeling, what considerations they make about the data manifold, and their chosen modeling level. Analyzing models in the light of these different lenses may be helpful in understanding the trade-offs between the different models, troubleshoot their failures, and think of possible model improvements. In the final session of our tutorial, Danilo and I will describe some high-level multidisciplinary ideas that may be useful to inform the design of new representation learning models, and how to go about evaluating the quality of learned representations. As you may have gathered from this tutorial, the problem of unsupervised representation learning is ill-posed. The intuition is that we want to learn a function that will reformat the incoming information about the data into a form that would make solving many downstream tasks easier. But the specifics of how to achieve that and why one representational form may be better than the other are so far up for debate. In order to continue building the next generation of improved representation learning models, it may be useful to look to other disciplines for inspiration. For example, neuroscience may provide clues about what representational format is used in an existing system that can solve many tasks efficiently and well, the brain. Physics may provide insights into the structures of the physical world that shape both the development of intelligence and the nature of common downstream tasks. Linguistics may provide insights about language, arguably one of the key precursors and byproducts of intelligence. And mathematics is useful as a repository of a vast array of tools for understanding, evaluating, and troubleshooting new representation learning ideas. So let's go over some of the relevant ideas from these fields in no particular order. The first important idea to consider is the distinction between invariance and equivariance in our representations. An invariant representation attempts to remove information about the so-called nuisance transformations that are irrelevant for a task. For example, object identity remains unchanged by translations, so a representation that ignores translations will be useful for solving object categorization tasks. Convolutional neural networks have built-in translation invariance as part of their architecture, which has been the key to their success. But what happens if we are trying to solve an object localization task where translations do matter? If we want to have a general representation that can be helpful for solving many a priori unknown tasks, it might be better to instead learn an equivariant representation. Instead of ignoring nuisance transformations, an equivariant representation reflects them. So, if a transformation is applied in the input space, an equivariant representation will also be transformed in an equivalent manner. An equivariant representation that preserves transformations but reformats them in a way that makes them easy to ignore when necessary can support many downstream invariance learning tasks. Another important idea to consider is that of compositionality, a key ingredient of human language. Compositionality enables open-endedness, the ability to construct an arbitrarily large number of meaningful complex expressions from a finite number of constituent parts and rules used to combine them. For example, the sentence, "I saw the man with the binoculars," can be interpreted in two different ways, depending on which of the two syntactic parsing trees is inferred. In the first instance, the man we're seeing has the binoculars, while in the second, it's us who has the binoculars. While the constituent parts in both scenarios are exactly the same, different syntactic rules used to recombine them produce different meanings. Representations that support compositionality can therefore be very powerful in terms of expressibility and efficiency of learning. Changing gears, another important idea to consider is that of symmetries. It comes from physics and appears to underlie a large part, if not all, of modern physics. Quoting Mario Livio's Nature article, "To a physicist, symmetry is a broader concept than the reflective form of butterfly wings. Symmetry represents those stubborn cores that remain unaltered, even under transformations that could change them." To unpack that, we will use an example of a simple spring mass system. The system can be unrolled forward in time to produce a bounce, or it can be translated in space. The two transformations can be applied interchangeably without affecting the final state of the system. This commutative property of the two transformations means that one is a symmetry of the other, an idea formally captured in Emily Noether's first theorem, which showed that for every continuous symmetry transformation, there was a corresponding conserved quantity, the stubborn core of our world. Ever since the publications of Noether's first theorem, symmetries were used to unify existing theories in physics, categorize, and even to predict the existence of new physical objects. The general idea applies more abstractly too. For example, 3D scenes can be transformed by changing the size of an object or its position, and the two transformations can be interchanged without affecting the final state. And hence, they can be seen as symmetries of each other. By splitting the observed dynamics into transformations that commute, do not affect each other, or in other words, are symmetries of each other, we automatically recover the meaningful, stable entities of the world too. So figuring out how to learn a representation that is equivariant to symmetry transformations can be an important step in representation learning research. Switching to neuroscience now, another way to think about how to build better representations is to consider what properties they should have based on the evidence collected from the brain. An excellent recent review article by Yale Neve suggests that representations in the brain should be amenable to dynamic clustering. This is both in terms of clustering perceptually dissimilar experiences into a single cluster to aid generalization, and pulling apart perceptually similar experiences into separate clusters to learn different behaviors for different tasks that may arise in the same situation. In order to implement such seemingly opposing clustering objectives, a representation should support dynamic attentional processes and include latent variables, for example, to represent the task context. To unpack that, let's imagine that we are at a busy intersection and our task is to get home safe. One way to do so is to represent our state as the yellow node in the Markov decision process. We keep the information about being on the sidewalk, and we use attention to ignore all the other details, like what the weather is like, who is standing next to us, or what we're wearing. This is good because it allows us to generalize our experience across these nuisance variations. However, By ignoring too much, we end up with an MTP where there is no guaranteed policy for getting home safe. We're either stuck waiting indefinitely on the sidewalk or risk being hit by a car if we do decide to go. However, if we use attention to include more information into our state, like whether there is a car approaching or not, hence splitting the yellow state into two, we see that there is a guaranteed safe policy, which is to move only when we are in state S1A. If our task were not to get home, but to hail a taxi, we would require even more information, like the color of the approaching car. To summarize, neuroscience evidence suggests that the brain may be using a representation that can be dynamically reshaped through attentional processes to include more or less information, always attempting to include only the minimal necessary variables for supporting optimal decision-making. The more nuisance information is passed through, the more generalization suffers. We have seen a few examples of interdisciplinary ideas that continue shaping our thinking about representation learning. By increasing diversity in our field, we're likely to come across many more useful ideas like that. So to conclude this part of the session, I would like to mention an important guiding principle nicely summarized in Richard Sutton's blog linked. When it comes to using multidisciplinary inspiration in our research, it is important to avoid hand engineering too many details into our models, which can be counterproductive and limit the powers of learning and optimization. Instead, we should only be using high-level fundamental ideas and use them to bias learning. To give concrete examples from neuroscience and physics, building in the spiking dynamics or Newton's equations of motion into our models may not be ideal, while biasing the models towards learning Euclidean-like representation manifolds or representations that are equivariant to symmetry transformations may be a better route. The final topic of this tutorial is how to go about evaluating representations. I will give an overview of the general existing frameworks, and Danilo will go over a few concrete success stories. When it comes to evaluating representations, the short story is that there is no standardized way of doing so, which makes it hard to measure progress. In general, representations are typically evaluated either based on downstream task performance, whether the representation helps with many tasks, and whether the subsequent task learning is more efficient, or by directly assessing particular properties of the learned representation. Evaluating representations based on task performance makes a lot of sense, since this is exactly the motivation for learning representations in the first place. However, choosing a diverse enough, representative, and informative set of evaluation tasks is hard in its own right. There are currently two existing evaluation frameworks: the Visual Task Adaptation Benchmark from Google and the Self-Supervision Benchmark from Facebook. The Facebook benchmark uses natural images to measure the model's performance on image classification, object detection, surface normal estimation, and visual navigation tasks. The Google benchmark also includes similar natural image tasks, but it also has additional specialized and structured tasks, such as understanding medical images, remote sensing, understanding the geometry of 3D game environments, as well as counting or detecting the size of or orientation of objects. Both frameworks accept pre-trained models without many restrictions on how the pre-training is done. They then test the performance of the models on a number of tasks by training a simple classifier on top of the model's representation, using few adaptation examples. The model itself may also be fine-tuned in the process. Representations may also be evaluated in the reinforcement learning framework. Here, the OpenAI CoinRun or DeepMind's DMLab environments can come in useful by providing a diverse set of training and evaluation tasks, both structurally and visually. Measuring task performance evaluates whether representations have some desirable properties indirectly. If these desirable properties are known explicitly, we can also try to measure them directly. For example, statistical disentangled representation learning aims to learn single latent dimensions that represent interpretable transformations. One way to measure this is through latent traversal visualizations, where we first encode an image, then manipulate the value of each learned latent dimension one at a time, and observe the effect it has on the resulting reconstruction. In the example shown, it's obvious that the representation is well disentangled, since single latents end up controlling single interpretable properties of the scene. Such visualizations, however, become harder to interpret for non-visual data. To avoid the qualitative aspect of latent visualizations, it's also possible to try and quantify the degree to which the representation has the desired property. Continuing with the disentanglement example, a number of metrics have been proposed that attempt to measure the alignment between the desirable ground truth generator factors and the learned latent dimensions. However, they often disagree with each other, either because they measure different aspects of the alignment or because they disagree about what desirable ground truth factors are. The development of a principled and accurate disentanglement metric that doesn't rely on the exact specification of human-labeled ground truth factors is still an open research question. When learning a representation, an implicit assumption is often that it will produce useful clustering of the data, and a number of metrics have been proposed for measuring the quality of such clustering. These approaches typically rely on some measure of precision or recall obtained from a simple nearest neighbor classifier. Although these measures are used extensively in the literature, a recent review paper by Musgrave et al. Has shown that they often fail to detect differences in the learned representational form. For example, the three representations of the toy dataset shown in the slide all score similarly according to these measures, despite having different clustering properties. Furthermore, since these measures rely on a nearest neighbor-based classifier, the fundamental question of how to measure distances correctly that we discussed in the manifold learning section resurfaces once again. I will now pass the slides to Danilo, who will talk about some particular instances where the utility of unsupervised representation learning has been demonstrated.
Hi, now that we have discussed the general questions regarding the evaluation of learned representations, let's talk about some particular instances where the utility of unsupervised representation learning has been demonstrated in practice. So first, let's look at the utility of disentangled representations. So as Irina mentioned previously, our working definition of disentanglement is a learned map from a high-dimensional input space to a low-dimensional vector space, such that this vector space is a direct sum of independent subspaces, where each subspace is equivariant to a unique transformation, such as changing color, translation, etc. So, for example, we think that this representation should be very useful for downstream tasks if they can be expressed as a function of only a small subset of the subspaces. Our hypothesis is that this should enable the downstream networks to learn how to solve such tasks using simpler class of functions, so small MLPs, leading to better data generalization and efficiency and data efficiency. Now, a very nice empirical demonstration of such hypothesis has been carried by Locatello and colleagues. They studied the effect of some form of disentanglements on task performance for various tasks, and we summarize 4 of them here. The tables on top of the slide rank correlations between different disentangling metrics and the model performance on different tasks. So I have 4 tasks, and these tables at the top, they show different ways of measuring disentanglement and the task performance. So we see that on average, more disentangled models are able to solve classification tasks in a more data efficient manner, using a simple classifier on top of the learned representation. So this is shown on the leftmost column. Moreover, the resulting classifiers are fairer to unobserved sensitive variables. So this is shown on the second column. And they generalize better under covariate shifts, where the test data is sampled outside the convex hull of the training data. This is shown on the third column. So this point about the convex hull is quite important, because it demonstrates that we are measuring performance on an extrapolative regime, not interpolative regime, which is very hard with some machine learning. Furthermore, disentangled representations also help to the more spatial reasoning tasks, like this IQ-like test on the right, in a data-efficient manner. Obviously, we can extend these ideas and experiments to reinforcement learning. For example, if the task is to collect blue spheres in a three-dimensional environment, like we can see in the image, then the performance of the resulting policy should not be affected by changes in the size of the sphere. So this task should be easier to learn if the nuisance transformations, size, color, etc., are disentangled into subspaces that are independent from those necessary to solve the task, so that the learning doesn't have to undo this, the entanglement between this the useful and the not useful information. Indeed, we were able to show that policies learned on top of disentangled representations were transferred to new combinations of objects and backgrounds significantly better than the same policies learned on top of entangled representations. So in this experiment here, the task was to pick up cans and cakes, and avoid hats or balloons. So in one of two possible rooms, the trick is that the agents were trained in the green combinations of objects and room, and tested in a zero-shot way in the red combinations. And we demonstrate here in the numerical results that our disentangled agent Darla was able to collect significantly more reward in the transfer scenario compared to entangled baselines. Again, this is a much easier task to solve by this agent, because the disentangled representation has an explicit separation between the color of objects, the type of objects, and their position. So going further in the reinforcement learning direction, these ideas can also be useful in model-based exploration, where agents can explore based on more meaningful statistics, such as object-level properties, rather than low-level statistics like pixel statistics. So here is a demonstration of what this model, how this model represents the inputs. The data is coming from a simple grid word environment made out of random colored objects. And the internal representation learned by this model not only segments the objects themselves, but represents each object's properties in a disentangled manner. So it factors out the position, shape, and color of the object, for example. Now, this very nice structured representation can be used in many ways in reinforcement learning, but in particular can be used to very efficient exploration as well at the object position level, for example. And indeed, using this model, and build an agent on top of this representation, this agent can generalize in a very data-efficient manner to a wide variety of tasks, using exactly the same representation, but different task structure. Now, switching topics to contrastive learning. As Ali mentioned, these methods of contrastive learning have been quite successful in semi-supervised learning recently, and here we just want to go through some of these results. First, on the left, we have a very simple contrastive learning algorithm called the CPC that was used in a semi-supervised regime for ImageNet classification. And we can see that it's very data efficient relative to a model that only sees pixels without any contrastive losses on top. And on the right, we have another model called the SimClear, which is a combination of data augmentation with contrastive learning, which allowed it to also demonstrate substantial data efficiency gains in classification. In addition to that, both likelihood and contrastive methods also benefit from better architecture, in this case, attention-based architectures. And good examples of that are BERT and IGPT-like models, which are based on likelihood-based, which use likelihood-based losses in combination with transformer networks. So this combination was demonstrated to be very powerful in semi-supervised learning recently for both text and image classification, and this kind of model is the state of the art now in this regime. Now, going on the direction of likelihood-based models again, and on the theme of representation learning via generative modeling, we will look into two different generative model examples. The first is called the GQN. GQN is a conditional generative model of frames on a 3D scene. These frames, it encodes observed data as pairs of frames and cameras in a permutation invariant representation vector that can then be used to solve downstream tasks after the model is trained. And that's what we did. Here we use the representation in a RL task. The task is to control the robot arm to reach random objects in a room. So we can see that at the right, that the policy working on top of features learned by GQN, blue curves, are substantially more data efficient than policy working on raw pixels, orange curves. So this is the total reward collected by the agent. So the higher, the better. And moreover, since GQN learned representations are more stable under camera transformations, the GQN-based agent can solve the hard task where the input views at each time step come from random cameras. So while the pixel-based agent takes a very, very long time to solve the task in this regime. Another promising direction for a likelihood-based representation learning is to use the generative models, to use more traditional generative models like state space models to form belief states about what they think the surrounding environment looks like, and then use this belief state as the representation used by the agent. And we investigated this in the SimCore with the SimCore model. So here we demonstrate in a very complex task where the agent has to build structures and stairs in order to collect the yellow reward blocks. So this is a very combinatorial and completely procedural environment where naive agents take a very long time to solve. So naive agents that only access pixels have hard time solving these tasks, and that they require an enormous amount of data. But the agents built on top of belief states formed by the generative model that's trying to predict the far future of this environment are considerably data efficient. And here we have, in this particular example, we have a factor of 4 in data efficiency. Now, what are the main takeaways? So we really would like to emphasize 4 points from this tutorial. So first of all, good representations are abstractions that make downstream computation more efficient and then simplify solving these downstream tasks. However, without a narrow specification of these downstream tasks, the problem is underspecified. And we have to introduce various trade-offs in order to be able to learn such representations. And there is no principled way of deciding in advance how to do that. But a lot of progress is being done in this direction. Finally, as we have seen, our journey towards better representation learning has led us through various topics in different fields of research, such as topology, differential geometry, group theory, physics, neuroscience, and cognitive neuroscience. So this is really not just about machine learning. If we think that the representations will be used for downstream tasks, is really a combination of multiple factors that we want to account. And finally, I would like to conclude with an example of the most successful self-supervised learning algorithm that we know of, a human baby. And we'd like to conclude by inviting you to think about what it takes to replicate that. What do we need to replicate such advanced form of unsupervised learning? Thank you very much.